even more so than the American Revolution. But it has a sort of weird ending, okay? Here's how history goes. Sometimes things happen that people expect, this won't be a big deal. This will never be remembered. And then it turns into something huge. Conversely, sometimes you have an event that everyone says, whoa, this is going to be a huge deal. And then in the end, you're like, yeah, that wasn't that big a deal. One of those is the American Revolution. One of those is the French Revolution. I won't tell you which. Here's what we're going to do. There's an assignment, the very first thing you can actually click on. It says 3 estate system sourcing. It has a little A+ icon. Open that guy up. And before we start reading this and looking at it, we kind of have to put things in context. This is one of 2 assignments you'll turn in this week. There's no final test or big grade. It's just another week of learning interesting stuff in here. So the end of the semester doesn't mean anything except your grades are set in stone after this week. Okay? Which for some of you, I hope you have things to do while you're grounded. Because that's where it looks like you're going to be if your grades were permanent. So, let's explain what is going on in France at the time. Almost every European country is governed, it's run, the same way. Does anyone know anything about European governments in the early 18th century? So we're talking 1700s. What's a form of government that you know? Okay, republicanism. Most of them, other than the Dutch, are not republics. Like 1 or 2%. But there are some.
Monarchy.
Monarchy, which means what?
Like a king or queen.
And they pretty much have unlimited power. Exactly. Okay? There's no voting. You don't get to elect the leaders. You usually don't get to make your own laws either. Okay? France is a monarchy. And they have some kings that history tells us were popular and well-liked because they have cool nicknames like King Louis XIV was the Sun King because he was king for so long. But then there's King Louis XVI, who's not going to have a happy ending. He's going to get his head chopped off if you don't know how the story goes. Okay? But here's how France was run at the time. A social structure called the 3 estates system. That's what today is going to be about. Who's each estate and what's their life like from sources at the time? Okay? And one of the things you should think about is which one would I fit into if I lived in France? Like take my family, their position, their jobs, their wealth, plug me into pre-revolutionary France, where would I be? Okay? Before we do that, something we have to figure out. This word revolution, if you looked it up in a dictionary, which you don't have to do, it usually has 2 very different meanings. One that's more often used in history class, and one that's more often used in science class. Anybody know one meaning of the word revolution? Because we're calling this whole unit the French Revolution. Mr. Bell.
Change.
What kind of change?
Social change.
Okay, I mean degree-wise.
Big change.
Can we use more descriptive words?
Drastic change.
Okay, here's the one that I used. Radical change. What does radical mean?
I'm not sure.
Extreme or excessive. Usually it means like to a fault, right? Like we talk about people who are radical Muslims. It usually means like very hardcore extremist, and that's not a good thing. Okay, like to an unhealthy degree. So think about the American Revolution from 8th grade history and Mr. Bell. Does that definition fit the American Revolution? Did we go from King George III to a democratic republic where we make our own laws and things are totally different now? Is that the one we usually use in history class, radical change? Yes. Now, what about the science class definition?
Technological.
Okay, so you could say like the scientific, but here's the thing, if you talk about the scientific revolution, you mean that in a historical way, right? Like the invention of the telescope, that's what you mean? Okay, think about earth science or whatever you call freshman science. The school's most boring class, but that's between you and I.
It's got Nelson in it.
No, because it's about rocks.
It's 'cause it's got Nelson.
No, Nielsen. No one cares to hear your opinion.
It's true, though.
When we talk about planets, do we ever use the word revolution? Say with Earth.
Yeah.
Okay? What's it mean when you say the Earth revolves around the sun?
Like, it moves one full turn.
Circling around something? Okay. So 365 and 1/4 days from now, where will the Earth be relative to the sun?
Well, right here, yeah.
In the exact same spot. Do we agree?
Not exact, but that'll be roughly.
Did I not even specify the quarter of a day for leap years? I believe I did.
Oh.
We will be exactly where we are today, which means what's changed? We're right back where we started. Did you ever think of that? So it's weird because they're both valid definitions, but don't they mean opposite things? Radically different place or direction. Right back where you started. Now, if you saw how big the module is in Canvas, there's a lot of stuff in here. This is going to take us at least 3 weeks. It's super interesting. You'll like it, I promise. But which one do you think is going to fit, since this is history class and we're going to take roughly a month of our lives to learn about it? Would you be disappointed if it ended up being this one? Like, at the end of a month, you're like, we're right back to where we started. This was futile. You wasted 3 weeks of my life that I'll never get back. Nothing really changed in France. Would you be sad if that was the outcome or the ending of this story?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I won't tell you which one it is, but have that in the back of your mind. Okay? Now, the 3-estate system. There are 3 different estates, and I'm going to use my little marker, and sometimes it's not perfect, so bear with me. I'm also a horrible artist. Okay? Who do you think is going to be at the bottom? And we're talking in France, so there are no slaves, because in history, slaves are at the bottom, like last week. Who's a small step up from slaves?
Peasants.
That's the word we're going to use. You don't have to make this diagram. This is just for your information. So we call them the third estate. If you made a little pyramid that shows where they are and how many people in France fit in that category, surprise, surprise, peasants are at the bottom. And there are a lot of people in this category. Do you agree from my picture? It's impossible to know. At least 95% of French men and women would be the third estate. So I'm telling you this. I don't care who your parents are, what their job is, how much money you have or wealth. Everyone in this room, myself included, would be a peasant. Okay? And I'll explain why. Who the heck might be above them? Exactly. We are going to call them the nobility, also known as like the aristocracy, the wealthy people. It means the families with a lot of money and land. Okay? And you might think like, well, my family's not poor, or we own a farm or a ranch. You're not going to fit in this category. Okay? These guys were probably 1.5%, maybe 2% of all of France. Are any of your families in the wealthiest 1 or 2% of all Americans? Are any of your families billionaires with a B? No? Okay. Didn't think so. Okay? You might be a millionaire. You still wouldn't be in the top 1.5% of Americans today. Okay? Now, if we have poor people and rich people, didn't we cover all of our bases as far as money goes? Because here's the thing, the king and the queen don't get their own spot. That's 1 or 2 people. There's another social group that's about 0.5 to 1% of the population. I know Tim knows because he could probably teach class today. That's a good guess. It's not based on money that these people are at the top. It's based on something else. Anyone want to take a guess? I know you know.
Generals?
Very good guess. The military will be relevant later. I'm just praying somebody gets this one. Yeah.
People of the royal bloodline.
Nope. Like the royal family. They're not on the pyramid. They're the pinpoint on the top. This has nothing to do with money, or even your last name or who your relatives are. It has to do with who you work for.
Oh, the
Yeah.
church?
How'd you get that?
I thought about the Pope.
Oh, I'm glad you thought about the Pope.
Was I right?
I was trying to give you a hint, and I said I'm praying somebody gets it if you didn't get my hint.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't get your hint.
None of you get my jokes. It's okay. Now, a word that you haven't seen very often, but it's a simple, common word. Clergy, not clergy, so like J sound. Clergy covers any job you could say you work for a church. So I think of it like this. If you go knock on different churches and say, what do you call the dude or lady who gets up on Sundays and gives the sermons or reads from your holy book? This one says pastor, that one says bishop, this one says priest, that one says deacon. We need one term to describe all of those.
Man of the Lord.
Clergy. No, because there are women too. Have you ever heard of a nun?
I have.
We got to count them. So clergy is not gender specific. It's not all men. And do some churches have like female pastors and...
Not that I've seen.
Yes, they do.
Oh.
Okay? So, if you look at our pyramid, the clergy or the church is at the top. The nobles, the wealthy landowners, are towards the top, and then you have everybody else. Now, none of you are economists. In fact, some of you probably couldn't even spell economics. That's okay. You don't have to be to answer this question. If you could only pick one of those estates, one of those groups of people, to pay taxes in your country, which one would be the worst choice? Because that's the one that was taxed under this system.
Clergy?
I know what you're going to say, you German socialist. The peasants are the worst choice, do you agree? They have the least money. And think about it. Take 98% of your people. What's the bottom 5% living like? Think about in America today. What's the bottom 5% income-wise, like based on how much money they have? What's their life look like? Okay, they may or may not have a place to live. This is something your parents find very important, and you will find it too when you get older. You think they have health insurance? You think they can afford to go to the doctor when they're sick? And what happens to those kind of people?
They die.
Well, everybody dies. You die of preventable things because the cough turns into something worse and you never go see a doctor. They probably don't have a lot of food on the table. They probably don't have a bank account or a credit card. Now, here's what's crazy. Let's just tax them. Let's not tax the wealthy landowning guys or the church. And you might say, well, we don't tax churches today, Mr. McKelkey. That's true, but the church singular in pre-revolutionary France was rich. And I'll show you how rich in a minute. So think about it. You don't have to know much about government and economics. Does it make sense to only tax these guys? That's how this worked. Now, take this huge group of people, make them pay taxes. Here's how the voting, so to speak, would work. If the king wanted to humor the people and say, hey, I have this law, I'll let you guys pick if we should do it or if this is a good idea, each estate gets one vote. Even though this one has 98% of the people, they only get one vote. And who do you think is always going to vote together?
The clergy.
The first two estates. So, does your vote even matter if these two guys always vote together?
No.
Okay, if I told you, okay, class, I'll let you vote on what we studied today. You all get one vote, I get 25. We could go through the process of voting, and I could write down what you want to learn and what she does, but I'm just going to pick at the end of the day anyways, right? So that's all a facade. Like, it looks good to say you get to vote, but your vote doesn't count. Do you think these peasants might not be big fans of this system? Do you see how a revolution is going to come out of this already? You should be able to. Okay? Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to read some sources. So I don't care if you do the download or the preview. There's a PDF we read and a Google Doc we type on. Okay? And I don't care how you open it. There's probably 10 different ways. Here's how this is going to work. We're going to read about the different estates from primary sources, and they're going to be thought-provoking and descriptive, like what life was like. And then we're going to answer a couple questions, basically comparing two sources about the same estate that are different. And then at the bottom, we're going to sort of put them in a chart and say, what would life have been like for each of these classes? And what do you think these people would want to tell the king? Okay, if we get to it, we have a political cartoon at the bottom.